The streetlights flickered weakly, their cold orange glow barely piercing through the thick veil of mist that had settled over the town. It was the kind of night that seemed to hold its breath, silent except for the faint hum of electricity and the occasional distant bark of a dog. The sidewalks were cracked and uneven, lined with graffiti-stained walls and abandoned storefronts that whispered tales of a forgotten prosperity. The air carried a chill, but it wasn't just the temperature that made it uncomfortable. It was the weight of something unspoken, something lurking just beyond the shadows. At the far end of the street, a man walked with a deliberate, measured pace. He wasn't old, but there was an ageless quality about him, as though he'd lived through more than his years should have allowed. His broad shoulders were draped in a dark hoodie, the hood pulled low to shield his face from prying eyes. By his side, a sleek, muscular dog padded silently, its coat as black as the night. The dog moved with a calm confidence, its ears twitching at every sound, its piercing eyes scanning the surroundings with a sharpness that suggested it was more than just a loyal companion. The man's name was Marcus Kane. He wasn't from around here. That much was clear from the way the few people who passed him gave him sideways glances. Some whispered under their breath. Others crossed the street entirely. Marcus ignored them. He'd grown accustomed to the stares, the murmurs, the subtle hostility that followed him wherever he went. It wasn't just his towering frame or the way he carried himself, like someone who had been through hell and come out harder for it. It was his presence. There was something about Marcus that unsettled people, even if they couldn't quite put their finger on why. He tightened his grip on the leash, though the dog didn't need it. Shadow, as he called her, was impeccably trained. She walked in perfect sync with Marcus, her every movement a mirror of his. Together they cut an imposing figure, one that spoke of unspoken strength and unyielding determination. But Marcus wasn't looking for trouble. Not tonight. He'd come to this town to escape, to find a semblance of peace, though he knew deep down that peace was a luxury men like him could never truly afford. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Marcus had only been here for a few weeks, but already he'd felt the cold, unwelcoming gaze of its residents. They didn't ask questions, they didn't need to. To them, Marcus was an outsider, a stranger who didn't belong. And in a town like this, being an outsider was enough to make you a target. As he turned a corner, the air grew heavier, almost suffocating. The streetlights here were dimmer, their light barely reaching the cracked asphalt below. Marcus glanced around, his instincts kicking in. He didn't like this part of town. It was too quiet, too isolated. Shadow let out a low growl, so soft it was almost imperceptible, but Marcus heard it. He always did. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice low and steady, but even as he said it, his eyes scanned the darkness ahead. Something wasn't right. He could feel it, a prickling at the back of his neck, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that set his nerves on edge. Marcus had learned to trust that feeling. It had saved his life more times than he cared to count. The sound of laughter broke the silence, harsh and mocking. Marcus slowed his pace, his jaw tightening. A group of figures emerged from the shadows, their movements deliberate, their intentions clear. They were young, too young to be this dangerous, yet old enough to know exactly what they were doing. There were 5 of them, each wearing the kind of smug expression that came from a lifetime of getting away with whatever they wanted. Well, one of them sneered, stepping forward. He was tall and wiry, his face twisted into a cruel grin. "Look what we have here." Marcus didn't respond. He simply stood there, his body still but coiled like a spring, ready to explode into action at a moment's notice. Shadow growled again, louder this time, and the gang shifted uneasily. "Quiet your mutt," another one said, though his voice lacked the confidence of his companions. Marcus didn't flinch. He met their gaze head-on, his dark eyes unreadable, his face a mask of calm. But inside, a storm was brewing. He didn't want this. Not here, not now. But he also knew that walking away wasn't an option. Not with men like these. They wouldn't let him. The leader of the group stepped closer, his grin widening. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just too scared to talk." Still, Marcus said nothing. His silence wasn't born of fear. It was a choice, a deliberate refusal to give them the reaction they wanted. He knew their type: bullies, cowards masquerading as tough guys. But cowards were dangerous when they had numbers on their side. Shadow barked, sharp and sudden, and the sound echoed down the empty street. The leader flinched, just for a moment, but it was enough for Marcus to see the cracks in his facade. "Shut that dog up!" one of the others shouted, his voice tinged with panic. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low and steady like the rumble of distant thunder. "Walk away." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that hung heavy in the air. For a moment the gang hesitated, their bravado faltering under the intensity of Marcus's gaze. But then the leader laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the walls. "You think you can scare us?" he sneered. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Marcus's expression didn't change, but inside, something shifted. A part of him he'd tried to bury, to leave behind, stirred awake. He'd spent years running from it, trying to be someone different, someone better. But there were times when the world wouldn't let him. Times like this. The leader took another step forward, and Marcus tightened his grip on Shadow's leash. The dog was tense, her muscles coiled, her eyes locked on the gang. She was ready, waiting for the command that Marcus hadn't yet given. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. But there was something in his tone, something that made the gang pause. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. And then, without warning, the leader lunged forward, his hand reaching for Marcus. Shadow barked, loud and fierce, and in that moment the night seemed to shatter. The streetlights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the scene, and Marcus moved. Everything happened in an instant, but it felt like time had slowed. Marcus stepped to the side, his movements fluid and precise, and the leader's outstretched hand grabbed nothing but air. But before Marcus could act further, a shout rang out from behind him, a sound that sent a chill down his spine. "Get him!" And then they were on him. The night erupted into chaos, but Marcus Kane was no ordinary man. And as the gang soon discovered, they had just unleashed something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The night seemed to hold its breath as the gang charged at Marcus and Shadow. For an instant, time slowed, each heartbeat punctuating the chaos as Marcus moved with the kind of precision that could only come from years of hard-earned experience. His body reacted on instinct, a perfect blend of speed, control, and power. But as the chaos unfolded, Marcus's mind drifted, as it often did in moments like these, to the choices that had led him here. 7 years earlier, the desert sun was merciless, beating down on the endless expanse of sand and jagged rock. The air shimmered with heat, distorting the horizon into an ever-shifting mirage. Marcus crouched behind a battered stone wall, his rifle steady in his hands, his breath slow and controlled. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back, soaking into the heavy fabric of his fatigues, but he paid it no mind. His focus was absolute. "You good, Kane?" A voice crackled in his earpiece. It was Ramirez, his squad leader, a man Marcus had come to trust with his life. "Good," Marcus replied, his voice calm despite the chaos unfolding around them. He glanced at the rest of his team, their faces grim but resolute. They were outnumbered, pinned down by an enemy force that seemed to multiply with every passing minute. But Marcus wasn't worried. He'd been in worse situations. He always found a way. That was who he was back then. A soldier, a protector, a weapon. The army had honed him into something sharp, something lethal. And for a time, he'd believed in the mission, believed that what he was doing mattered. But over the years, the lines had blurred. The enemies he'd fought began to look less like monsters and more like men. The missions became messier, the collateral damage harder to justify. He started to question whether the ends truly justified the means. And then, there was the mission that changed everything. It had been a routine extraction, or so they were told. But when Marcus and his team arrived at the target location, They found more than just enemy combatants. There were civilians, women, children, caught in the crossfire of a conflict they didn't understand. The orders were clear: complete the mission, no matter the cost. But Marcus couldn't do it. Not this time. He disobeyed direct orders, risking his life and the lives of his team to evacuate the civilians. In the end, they all made it out alive, but Marcus's decision came at a price. He was honorably discharged, his spotless record marred by a single act of defiance. To his superiors, he was a liability, but to those he'd saved, he was a hero. Marcus didn't feel like a hero. Not then, and not now. The present. The first of the gang members lunged at Marcus, a rusted crowbar in his hand. Marcus sidestepped the swing effortlessly, his movements so fluid they seemed almost choreographed. Before the attacker could recover, Marcus grabbed his wrist and twisted, the crowbar clattering to the ground. A sharp yelp of pain escaped the man's lips as Marcus shoved him backward, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. Shadow barked, a deep guttural sound that echoed through the empty streets. She positioned herself in front of Marcus, her body low, her teeth bared. Marcus didn't need to give her any commands. She knew exactly what to do. Another gang member rushed forward, this one wielding a switchblade. He slashed wildly, the blade glinting in the dim light, but Marcus was faster. He stepped inside the man's guard, delivering a quick, powerful strike to his ribs. The man doubled over, gasping for air, and Marcus disarmed him with a practiced ease. "Enough!" Marcus barked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a whip. His words carried a weight that stopped the remaining gang members in their tracks. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the ragged breaths of the two men writhing on the ground. But the leader, emboldened by his numbers, wasn't ready to back down. "You think you're tough, huh?" he sneered, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "You don't scare me." Marcus took a step forward, his gaze locked onto the leaders. "You should be scared," he said, his voice low and steady. "Because if you keep this up, you're going to leave here in worse shape than your friends." The leader hesitated, his bravado faltering. For a moment, it seemed like he might back down. But then, from somewhere behind Marcus, a voice called out, "Marcus, stop!" Marcus froze, his heart skipping a beat. He turned to see a young woman standing at the edge of the street, her face pale with worry. It was Elena, the owner of the small diner where Marcus had been working part-time since arriving in town. She was clutching a phone in one hand, her other hand pressed to her chest. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "Just let it go." The tension in Marcus's body began to unwind, though his mind was still racing. He glanced back at the gang, who were now retreating, dragging their injured friends with them. The leader shot Marcus a venomous glare, before disappearing into the shadows, but Marcus didn't care. They were gone for now. That was all that mattered. Shadow whined softly, nuzzling Marcus's leg, and he reached down to scratch behind her ears. "Good girl," he murmured. Elena approached cautiously, her eyes darting between Marcus and the direction the gang had fled. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded, though his hands were still shaking. "I'm fine." Elena hesitated, then reached out to touch his arm. "You don't have to do this," she said. "You don't have to fight." Marcus looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes you don't have a choice." Elena didn't respond. She just stood there, her brow furrowed with concern. Marcus could see the questions in her eyes, the unspoken curiosity about who he was and where he'd come from. But she didn't ask, and for that, he was grateful. Later, that night, Marcus sat alone in his small apartment, the dim light from a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Shadow lay at his feet, her head resting on her paws, her breathing slow and steady. The events of the night replayed in Marcus's mind, each moment etched into his memory. He reached for the dog tags hanging around his neck, running his thumb over the engraved letters. They were a reminder of a life he'd left behind, a life he sometimes wished he could forget. But no matter how far he ran, The past always had a way of catching up to him. As he sat there, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. Marcus tensed, his senses on high alert. He reached for the knife he kept hidden under the table, his hand gripping the hilt tightly. The footsteps stopped outside his door. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a single envelope was slid under the door. Marcus stared at it, his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly, he got up and approached, his every movement cautious. He picked up the envelope and turned it over in his hands. There was no name, no return address, just a plain, unmarked envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper folded neatly. Marcus unfolded it and read the words written in bold, blocky letters. "We know who you are." Marcus's blood ran cold. He looked down at Shadow, who was now on her feet, her ears perked up, her body tense. Someone had found him. The envelope weighed heavier in Marcus's hand than it had any right to, its implications sinking into him like jagged glass. For years, he'd lived like a ghost, moving from town to town, careful to keep a low profile. But this was a crack in the armor he had worked so hard to build around his life. Someone had found him. Someone new. Shadow whined softly at his feet, her sharp gaze fixed on the door as if daring whoever had left the envelope to come back. Marcus knelt beside her, running a calming hand along her sleek coat. "It's okay, girl," he murmured, though the words felt hollow. It wasn't okay. Not even close. He unfolded the paper again, scanning the simple, ominous message. "We know who you are." There was no signature, no hint of its sender. Just those 6 words. But Marcus had learned long ago that 6 words could be deadlier than 1,000. The next morning, Marcus walked into the diner, his shoulders squared but his jaw clenched tighter than usual. He could feel the tension lingering in the air as soon as he stepped through the door. Elena was behind the counter, wiping down the same spot for what must have been the 5th time. She looked up when she saw him, her brows knitting with concern. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said softly. Marcus offered a faint shrug, sliding into his usual seat by the window. Shadow sat obediently by his feet, her alert eyes sweeping the diner. "Something like that." Elena hesitated, her lips pressing together as though she wanted to say more but thought better of it. She poured him a cup of coffee, setting it in front of him without a word. It wasn't until the lunch rush that things took a darker turn. Marcus had been cleaning a table near the back when he caught the sound of laughter, sharp, mocking, and familiar. He straightened, his eyes narrowing as the gang from the previous night sauntered in, their leader swaggering like he owned the place. His name, Marcus had learned, was Nate. Nate's gaze landed on Marcus almost immediately, a smirk curling at the edges of his lips. He leaned against the counter, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "Didn't think we'd see you again so soon, big guy. Thought maybe you'd be too scared to show your face." The words hung in the air, drawing the attention of the other diners. Marcus kept his expression neutral, though his hands balled into fists at his sides. "I'm just here to work," he said evenly, refusing to rise to the bait. "Work?" Nate snorted. "Is that what you call hiding? You think you're better than us, don't you?" "Leave him alone, Nate," Elena interjected, stepping forward with a rare flash of defiance. Her voice trembled slightly, but she held her ground. "He's done nothing to you." "Oh, he's done plenty," Nate shot back, his grin widening. "You should have seen him last night. Guy thinks he's some kind of superhero jumping in like that. But you know what they say about heroes. They're only brave until someone shows them what real fear looks like." Marcus met Nate's gaze, his dark eyes steady. "You're wasting your time." Nate leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. "And you're wasting your breath, old man. This is my town, and you don't belong here. People, like you never do." The words stung more than Marcus wanted to admit, but he didn't flinch. He had heard it all before, seen the hate, the fear disguised as anger, the need to tear someone down just to feel powerful. He knew better than to give it oxygen. Elena stepped in again, her voice firm. "That's enough, Nate. You want to eat, fine. But if you're here to cause trouble, you can leave." Nate looked like he might argue, but after a tense moment, he pulled back with a lazy shrug. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. He and his crew settled into a booth near the back, their presence a dark cloud over the otherwise lively diner. Marcus kept his head down, but he could feel their eyes on him, like a pack of wolves sizing up their prey. That night, Marcus sat in his apartment, staring at the dog tag still clutched in his hand. The faint scars on his knuckles caught the dim light, each one a reminder of battles fought and wounds that never fully healed. He thought of the people he'd lost, friends, brothers in arms, faces that haunted his dreams. But more than that, he thought of his mother. She'd been his anchor, his guiding light. The one who taught him strength wasn't just about fists or weapons. It was about resilience, about standing tall even when the world tried to knock you down. He could still hear her voice, soft and steady, echoing in his mind. Marcus, you don't fight because you're angry. You fight because you care. Don't ever forget that. She had died while he was overseas, cancer taking her before he could say goodbye. He carried that guilt with him every day, a weight he couldn't shake. But it was her voice that reminded him why he kept going, why he fought, not just for himself but for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Shadows stirred at his feet, her ears perking up. Marcus frowned, his instincts kicking in. He rose silently, moving to the window. The street below was quiet, the faint glow of the streetlights casting long shadows. But then he saw it, a figure standing across the street, half hidden in the darkness. Marcus's heart quickened. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, watching. The next day, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Every time he turned a corner, every time he glanced over his shoulder, there was that faint sense of someone lingering just out of sight. He started noticing small things. A car parked too long in the same spot, footsteps echoing a little too close behind him. By the time he arrived at the diner, his nerves were frayed. Elena noticed immediately. Marcus, are you okay? She asked, her voice low enough that the other patrons wouldn't overhear. Just tired, he muttered, though the tightness in his jaw said otherwise. Elena hesitated, then reached out to touch his arm. If something's wrong, you can tell me. Marcus met her gaze, the concern in her eyes genuine. For a moment, he considered telling her everything. The envelope, the figure, the gnawing sense of dread. But he stopped himself. The less she knew, the safer she'd be. I'm fine, he said instead, forcing a small smile. Don't worry about me. But Elena wasn't convinced. And later that afternoon, when Nate and his crew showed up again, her worry deepened. This time, Nate wasn't content to throw insults. He lingered near Marcus, invading his space, his voice dripping with malice. You think you're tough, don't you? Think you can just waltz in here and act like you're better than the rest of us? I'm not looking for trouble, Marcus said quietly, his patience wearing thin. Too late, Nate shot back, leaning in close. Trouble's looking for you. That was when Marcus noticed it. Nate's hand sliding something out of his pocket, a knife. The tension snapped like a rubber band, the diner falling deathly silent as Nate flicked the blade open. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The other patrons froze, their eyes wide with fear, but Marcus didn't freeze. His training kicked in, his movements swift and precise. Before Nate could even register what was happening, Marcus grabbed his wrist, twisting it until the knife clattered to the floor. The room erupted into chaos. Nate's crew surged forward, but Shadow was on her feet in an instant, her bark sharp and menacing. Marcus pushed Nate back, his voice a low growl. Enough. Nate staggered, clutching his wrist, his face a mix of pain and humiliation. You're gonna regret this, he spat, backing toward the door. You hear me? This isn't over. And then they were gone, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. Elena approached Marcus cautiously, her eyes wide. Marcus, what just happened? Marcus didn't answer. He picked up the fallen knife, his jaw tight, and stared at the door Nate had disappeared through. Whatever this was, it was far from over. The knife felt heavier in Marcus's hand than it should have. Its cold steel gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the diner as he turned it over, his reflection faintly visible in its polished blade. He could still feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, even after Nate and his crew had fled. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rapid, shallow breaths of the customers who hadn't yet left. Shadow sat at his side, her ears still perked, her body rigid and ready. Elena broke the silence first. "Marcus, what are you going to do?" Her voice trembled and her eyes darted nervously toward the door, as if expecting Nate to burst back in at any moment. Marcus set the knife on the counter, the metallic clang echoing in the stillness. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low and gravelly. He wasn't used to not knowing. It was an uncomfortable feeling, one that settled deep in his chest and gnawed at him. Elena leaned closer, her hand gripping the edge of the counter. "You can't keep handling this alone. Nate isn't going to stop. You saw him. He's escalating." Marcus nodded but didn't look at her. Instead, his gaze drifted out the window, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He'd been in worse situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield where everyone knew the stakes. This was a small town, full of innocent people who could get caught in the crossfire if things spiraled out of control. "I'll take care of it," he said finally, his voice steady but distant. Elena frowned, her frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "You don't have to keep doing this. You don't always have to fight." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The truth was, he didn't know any other way. Fighting was the only thing that had ever made sense to him, the only thing he was good at. And if it meant keeping people like Elena safe, then so be it. That night, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the windows set his nerves on edge. Shadow was restless too, pacing the small apartment with her ears pinned back. It was as if the air itself carried a sense of foreboding, a weight, pressing down on them both. Around midnight, Marcus finally gave up on sleep. He pulled on his boots, clipped Shadow's leash to her collar, and stepped outside. The cool night air hit him like a splash of water, and for a brief moment he felt a flicker of clarity. But that clarity was short-lived. The streets were empty, the town eerily quiet. Marcus walked with purpose, his eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. Shadow stayed close to his side, her body tense, her movements deliberate. She could sense it too, that something was coming. As they turned a corner, Marcus saw it. A figure standing under a flickering streetlight, their face obscured by a hood. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, waiting. Marcus slowed his pace, his hand instinctively moving to the small knife he kept clipped to his belt. "Stay here," he murmured to Shadow, who let out a low growl but obeyed. He approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the empty street. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice firm but measured. The figure tilted their head slightly as if considering the question. When they finally spoke, their voice was low and gravelly, carrying an unsettling calm. "You don't belong here?" Marcus tensed, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his knife. "You've got the wrong guy." The figure laughed softly, a sound that sent a shiver down Marcus's spine. "Do I? You've been running for a long time, Kane, but you can't outrun your past." Marcus's blood ran cold. Whoever this was, they knew more than they should. "Who sent you?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, they stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they'd appeared. Marcus sprinted after them, but by the time he rounded the corner, the street was empty. Shadow barked behind him, her voice sharp and urgent. Marcus turned to see another envelope lying on the ground where the figure had been standing. He picked it up cautiously, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It was grainy, taken from a distance, but the subject was unmistakable. It was Elena standing outside the diner. Scrawled across the bottom of the photo in bold black letters were 3 words: "You can't protect her." Marcus's grip tightened. On the photo, his jaw clenching so hard it ached. Whoever was behind this wasn't just targeting him. They were threatening the people he cared about. And that was something Marcus couldn't allow. The next morning, Marcus made a decision. He walked into the diner before it opened, the bells above the door jingling softly. Elena looked up from behind the counter, surprised to see him so early. "Marcus, what's going on?" "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and serious. He glanced around to make sure they were alone before continuing. "You're in danger." Elena frowned, her confusion quickly turning to concern. "What are you talking about?" Marcus hesitated, debating how much to tell her. He didn't want to scare her, but she needed to know enough to stay safe. He pulled the photograph from his pocket and set it on the counter. Elena's eyes widened as she stared at the image. What is this?" "It's a warning," Marcus said grimly. "Someone's targeting me and they're using you to get to me." Elena's hands trembled as she picked up the photo. "Who would do this? Why?" Marcus ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. In the meantime, you need to stay away from me. Don't come to the diner. Don't answer the door for anyone you don't know. Just be careful." Elena shook her head, her voice rising with frustration. "You can't just shut me out, Marcus. If you're in trouble, I want to help." "You can't help," Marcus snapped, immediately regretting the harshness in his tone. He softened his voice. "I mean it, Elena. The best way you can help is by staying safe." Elena opened her mouth to argue but stopped when she saw the look in his eyes. There was something in them, something raw and haunted, that silenced her protests. She nodded reluctantly. "Okay, but promise me you'll be careful too." Marcus gave her a small, tight smile. "I will." The rest of the day passed in a blur of unease. Marcus kept his head down, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every noise, every shadow made his pulse quicken. Shadow was on edge too, her ears twitching at even the faintest sounds. As night fell, Marcus prepared for the inevitable. He locked the doors, checked his weapons, and waited. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop until they got what they wanted. And Marcus was determined to meet them on his terms. Around midnight, the first sound came, a faint scrape against the window. Marcus's heart pounded as he moved silently toward the sound, his knife in hand. Shadow growled low in her throat. Her body coiled like a spring, and then it happened. The window shattered, glass spraying across the room as a figure climbed through. They moved with practiced precision, their face obscured by a mask. Marcus didn't wait for them to make the first move. He lunged, his knife flashing in the dim light. The figure was fast, faster than Marcus had anticipated. They dodged his strike, countering with a blow that sent him stumbling backward. But Marcus recovered quickly, his training kicking in as he launched another attack. The room erupted into chaos, the sound of heavy blows and Shadow's fierce sparks filling the air. The intruder was skilled, but Marcus had faced worse. He fought with a brutal efficiency, his every move calculated and deliberate. But then, just as Marcus gained the upper hand, a second figure appeared in the doorway. And this one wasn't, wearing a mask. It was Nate. "Surprised to see me?" Nate sneered, a crowbar in his hand. "You didn't think I'd just let you humiliate me, did you?" Marcus's mind raced. This wasn't just a grudge anymore. It was something much bigger. But before he could react, Nate swung the crowbar, and everything went black. Darkness pressed around Marcus like a suffocating shroud. Faint sounds, muffled voices, the shuffle of footsteps, filtered into his awareness as he clawed his way back to consciousness. Pain throbbed in his head, sharp and rhythmic, like the strike of a hammer. Slowly his eyes fluttered open, revealing the dim outline of a room bathed in flickering fluorescent light. He was tied to a chair, thick ropes digging into his wrists and ankles. Across from him, Nate leaned casually against a workbench, twirling the crowbar in his hand. A smug grin spread across his face, but there was something else behind his bravado. a flicker of nervous energy that betrayed his confidence. Finally, awake, Nate sneered, setting the crowbar down with a deliberate clink. Took you long enough. Marcus blinked, forcing his vision to steady. Shadow. Where was Shadow? He scanned the room, his heart pounding until he saw her in the corner. She was alive but muzzled, her body tense as she strained against a chain tethering her to the wall. Nate caught his glance and chuckled. Don't worry, your mutt's fine for now. Figured I'd keep her out of the fun, though. Don't need her tearing anyone's throat out. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He knew better than to waste words. Instead, he focused on the room, cataloging every detail, the tools scattered across the bench, the faint hum of a generator, the single door behind Nate. He didn't recognize the place, but it felt isolated, remote. Nate leaned closer, his grin widening. You're probably wondering why you're here, or maybe you've already figured it out. Marcus remained silent, his expression unreadable. Nate's grin faltered slightly, and he pushed himself upright, pacing the room with exaggerated casualness. You think you're so tough, don't you? Nate said, his voice rising with each word. Waltzing into my town like you own the place, but I see right through you. You're not some hero. You're just another washed-up loser trying to play savior. Is that what this is about? Marcus finally said, his voice low and steady. Your ego? Nate froze, the muscles in his jaw twitching. For a moment it seemed like he might lash out, but then he laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Oh, it's so much bigger than that, Kane. You really don't know, do you? Marcus's eyes narrowed. Know what? Nate leaned in close, his face inches from Marcus's. This isn't just about me. This is about you. Your past. Your secrets. Did you really think you could hide forever? A chill ran down Marcus's spine, but he didn't let it show. What are you talking about? Nate stepped back, a glint of triumph in his eyes. You think I came after you on my own? You think this little feud started because of some bar fight? No, Kane. Someone wanted you found. Someone wanted you exposed. Marcus's stomach twisted. He thought of the envelope, the photograph, the cryptic messages. Someone had gone to great lengths to flush him out. But who? And why? Before he could press Nate further, the door creaked open, and a new figure stepped inside. Marcus's blood ran cold. It was the hooded figure from the street, the one who had slipped him the envelope. But now, their hood was down, revealing a face Marcus hadn't seen in years, a face he'd hoped to never see again, Colonel Victor Langston, Marcus's former commanding officer. Langston's presence filled the room like a storm cloud, oppressive and dangerous. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Marcus, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He looked older than Marcus remembered. His once dark hair streaked with gray, but the air of authority and menace was unchanged. Well, Langston said, his voice smooth and venomous. The prodigal son returns. Marcus's chest tightened. What the hell are you doing here? Langston took a slow, deliberate step forward, his hands clasped behind his back. Funny, I was about to ask you the same thing. You've been busy, Kane, running, hiding. But no matter where you go, the past has a way of catching up. Marcus clenched his fists, the ropes biting into his skin. I'm not running. I left. You know why. Oh, I know, Langston said, his smirk fading. You disobeyed orders. You compromised a mission. You made me look like a fool. I saved lives, Marcus shot back, his voice rising. Innocent lives, something you never cared about. Langston's eyes darkened, and for a moment, his composed facade cracked. You betrayed your unit, your country. You think your little act of heroism absolves you? No, Kane. You're a liability, and liabilities have to be dealt with. Marcus's mind raced. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about control. Langston had always been a man who valued loyalty above all else, a man who saw defiance as a personal affront. And now, he'd tracked Marcus down to settle the score. But there was something else, something unspoken that lingered in the air. Marcus could see it in Langston's eyes, a flicker of desperation, of urgency. Langston wasn't just here for payback, he wanted something. "What do you want, Langston?" Marcus demanded, his voice cold. "Why go through all this trouble?" Langston smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You still don't get it, do you? You're not just some rogue soldier. You're the only loose end from a mission that was never supposed to exist. A mission that certain interested parties would rather stay buried." Marcus's breath caught. He thought back to that final mission, the one that had ended his career. The civilians he'd saved weren't just casualties of war. They were witnesses to something the army had desperately tried to cover up. "They're still alive, aren't they?" Marcus said, realization dawning. "That's what this is about. You're afraid they'll talk?" Langston's smile disappeared. "Afraid? No, Kane. I'm ensuring they don't. And you're going to help me." Marcus's laugh was bitter and humorless. "You think I'm going to help you clean up your mess? You're insane." Langston's gaze hardened. "You don't have a choice. Either you cooperate or the people you care about—" He nodded toward Shadow. "Suffer the consequences." Marcus's heart pounded. Langston was playing his trump card, leveraging the very thing Marcus couldn't ignore. But as much as it terrified him, it also fueled his resolve. He wouldn't let Langston win. Not this time. As Langston turned to Nate, issuing orders in a low voice, Marcus subtly tested the ropes binding his wrists. They were tight, but not unbreakable. His mind worked quickly, formulating a plan. Shadow growled low in her throat, her eyes locked on Langston. She was waiting for a signal, for Marcus to make the first move. He met her gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. Langston turned back to Marcus, his smirk returning. "Time's up, Kane. What's it going to be?" Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he yanked his arms upward with all his strength, the ropes fraying against the sharp edge of the chair. With a loud snap, they gave way and Marcus sprang to his feet. The room exploded into chaos. Marcus moved with the precision of a man who had spent years in the heat of combat. He drove an elbow into Nate's jaw, sending him sprawling, then grabbed the crowbar from the workbench. Langston reached for his sidearm, but Marcus was faster, knocking it from his hand with a swift strike. "Shadow!" Marcus barked, and the dog lunged, her teeth sinking into the chain that bound her. With a sharp tug, she broke free, her powerful body leaping toward Nate as he scrambled to his feet. Langston backed toward the door, his calm demeanor shattered. "You don't know what you're doing, Kane," he shouted. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Marcus advanced on him, his eyes blazing. "I already did." Langston reached for a second weapon hidden at his ankle, but Marcus was on him in an instant, slamming him against the wall. The two men struggled, the room spinning as fists and knees collided. But Marcus had the upper hand, years of rage and regret boiling to the surface as he drove Langston to the ground. "Call them off," Marcus growled, his hands tightening around Langston's collar. "Now," Langston sneered, blood dripping from his lip. "You think this changes anything? You'll always be one of us." "Not anymore," Marcus said, his voice cold and final. With one last punch, Langston slumped to the floor, unconscious. Marcus stood over him, breathing hard, his fists clenched. The weight of everything, the years of running, the ghosts of his past seemed to lift, if only slightly. Behind him, Nate groaned, pinned to the ground by Shadow's snarling jaws. Marcus turned, his expression hard. "Leave this town. If I see you again, you won't get another warning." Nate nodded frantically, his bravado completely shattered. Marcus whistled, and Shadow released him, her eyes still blazing with fury. Nate scrambled to his feet and bolted, leaving Langston behind. As silence fell over the room, Marcus knelt beside Shadow, stroking her fur. "Good girl," he whispered, his voice soft. She licked his hand, her tail wagging faintly. For the first time in years, Marcus felt something he hadn't dared to hope for, a sense of control. But as he looked down at Langston's unconscious form, he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The fight had only just begun. The room was still, the air heavy, with the aftermath of chaos. Marcus stood over Colonel Langston's unconscious body, his breathing slowing as the adrenaline ebbed away. Shadow leaned against his leg, her body pressed close as if she too needed reassurance that it was finally over. Marcus glanced down at his knuckles, scraped and bloodied, before looking back at Langston. The man had spent years chasing shadows, obsessed with burying the past at any cost. But now he was just another broken remnant of the system he once commanded. Marcus's lips tightened in grim resolve. This wasn't just a fight he'd won. It was the end of something far darker. The call for justice. By the time the police arrived, summoned by a call Marcus had made after securing the scene, the story was already unfolding. The officers entered the warehouse cautiously, their flashlights casting long beams of light over the scattered tools, the broken window, and Langston's restrained form. One of the officers, a stern-looking woman in her 40s, fixed Marcus with a wary gaze. "You want to tell me what happened here?" Marcus nodded, stepping forward with calm authority. "It's all connected to a cover-up. Langston," he gestured to the man on the ground, "has been hunting me for years to keep a mission buried. It involved the deaths of innocent civilians and an operation that went off the books." The officer raised an eyebrow, skeptical but intrigued. "That's a big claim. I've got proof." Marcus pulled out a flash drive from his pocket, the one he'd retrieved from Langston's jacket during their struggle. "This has everything. Names, locations, classified orders. It's all there." The officer took the drive, her expression hardening as she glanced at Langston. "We'll see about that. For now, you're coming with us to the station." Marcus didn't resist. He knew he couldn't fight this battle alone, but with the evidence in hand and Langston's web of lies unraveling, he finally felt the weight of years of running begin to lift. Revelations and rebuilding. The days that followed were a whirlwind of interrogations, investigations, and media coverage. The flash drive turned out to be everything Marcus had promised and more. It contained not only evidence of Langston's corruption, but also files implicating several high-ranking officials in the cover-up of the botched mission. The story broke, nationally, sparking outrage and demands for accountability. Langston, stripped of his rank and paraded before the courts, faced charges ranging from conspiracy to attempted murder. His arrogance crumbled in the face of undeniable evidence, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The trial became a symbol of reckoning, a rare moment when justice triumphed over power. But for Marcus, the victory was bittersweet. The exposure of the truth didn't erase the pain of the past or bring back the lives lost. Still, it brought closure, a chance to stop running and finally confront the man he'd become. Healing old wounds. Elena was waiting for him. When he stepped out of the police station one crisp morning, his name finally cleared. Her arms were crossed, her expression equal parts relief and frustration. "You couldn't have warned me before dragging the entire town into this," she said, though her tone was light, almost teasing. Marcus chuckled softly, the sound unfamiliar, after so many years of silence. "Didn't exactly have time for a heads up?" She shook her head but smiled. "You scared the hell out of me, you know." "I know," Marcus said, his voice quiet. "I'm sorry." Elena's expression softened and she stepped closer. "You don't have to apologize. You did what you had to do, and I'm proud of you for standing up to them. For all of us." Her words hit harder than Marcus expected. He looked away, his throat tight. I didn't want anyone else to get hurt." Elena reached out, her hand brushing his arm. "You're not alone anymore, Marcus. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself." Marcus met her gaze, the warmth in her eyes grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe her. New beginnings. The town began to change in subtle but significant ways after the truth came out. The diner, once a place where Marcus had felt like an outsider, became a hub of support. Locals who had once eyed him with suspicion now greeted him warmly, their small gestures of kindness building bridges that had once seemed impossible. Elena's diner thrived, partly because of the media attention surrounding Marcus's story, but also because it had become a symbol of resilience. People came not just for the food, but for the sense of community that Elena had nurtured. And Marcus, to his own surprise, found himself becoming a part of that community. He started volunteering at the local animal shelter, helping train rescue dogs, a quiet nod to the bond he shared with Shadow. The work was grounding, giving him a sense of purpose that had eluded him for so long. Shadow, ever loyal, remained by his side through it all. Her presence was a constant reminder of the battles they'd fought together, and the quiet strength they'd found in each other. Reflection and growth. One evening, Marcus sat on the porch of his modest house at the edge of town, the setting sun casting golden hues over the landscape. Shadow lay at his feet, her eyes half closed as she enjoyed the cool breeze. Marcus held a photo in his hands, a snapshot of his mother taken years ago. Her warm smile and kind eyes seemed to radiate from the picture, filling him with a sense of peace. "I hope I made you proud," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. In many ways, his journey had been shaped by her memory, her words guiding him through the darkest moments. And now, as he looked out at the town that had once felt like a prison but now felt like home, he allowed himself to believe that she would have been proud. Marcus had spent so much of his life running, from his past, from his pain, from himself. But now he was done running. He was ready to face whatever came next, not as a soldier or a fugitive, but as a man who had finally found his place in the world. Hopeful futures. The fallout from Langston's exposure rippled far beyond the town. The Army announced sweeping reforms aimed at increasing transparency and accountability, a direct response to the public outrage sparked by the case. For the first time in years, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope that the system he'd once believed in might be capable of change. Elena became a quiet force in the town, her unwavering support for Marcus earning her respect from even the most skeptical residents. Together they worked to foster a sense of unity, creating spaces where people could come together and heal. One night, as Marcus locked up the diner after helping Elena close, she turned to him with a small smile. "So, what now?" Marcus shrugged, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Not sure, but for once I'm okay with that." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You've come a long way, you know." "So have you," he replied, his gaze steady. "And I'm glad we found each other." The unspoken bond between them, forged through trials and trust, was stronger than words. They didn't need to say more. A world made new. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Life in the town continued, shaped by the changes Marcus and Elena had helped set in motion. The scars of the past remained, but they were no longer the defining features of Marcus's story. Instead, they were reminders of how far he'd come. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, Marcus stood in the field behind his house, Shadow at his side. The world felt alive, full of possibility. He took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs, and allowed himself a rare moment of contentment. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid to find out. Marcus Kane, the man who had once been defined by his past, was finally ready to step into the light, and he wasn't alone.